Hey, what's going on, guys? The Horror Man back, counting down my top 20 favorite horror movies of the last 20 years. If you guys watch the Super Slash Brothers show live on Friday nights at 9 p.m. Eastern, and you should be, then you know this is a pretty hot topic. We discuss this quite often. Brad has been known to say a certain movie that will appear on my list is his favorite horror film from the last 20 years. And each week, it's inevitably mentioned. So, I thought it might be a good idea to count down my top 20 favorite horror films from the last 20 years. In other words, these are my top 20 favorite horror movies from the 21st century. This list will only include horror films released in the year 2000 or later. I should also mention I did not include multiple movies from the same franchise. So if you see one movie from a franchise, you won't see another on here. If I did, I could assure you in one case you'd see 4 separate movies from the same series. So I didn't want that to happen. It's also important to say that this is just my personal opinion. I created this list based on my personal preferences, whether it be rewatchability or other aspects of the film. I want to start off by saying Get Out will not be included on this list, before anyone asks. I've mentioned in the past I find Get Out to be very overrated. Now, it doesn't mean that I disliked the film because I thought it was really good, in fact. It just wasn't as good as everyone makes it out to be. So, it will not appear in my top 20. I mentioned in my review for Us that I actually prefer it to Get Out, but this one will also not be making the list. I like it, but not enough to crack my top 20. You will also not see Hereditary on here, and that's simply because I haven't seen it yet. I know, sort of blasphemy, I guess. It seems to be a very popular modern-day horror film, and I know it gets a lot of rave reviews. But I've also heard mixed things from some people, including my buddy Brad, who finds this one to be overrated. I'm not sure how I feel about it since, as I said, I haven't seen it, but regardless, it will not be appearing on this list because of that. And lastly, before I get into the countdown, I will also not be including The Witching Season. Now, you guys know I absolutely love this, but it's a series of shorts, each with their own individual opening credits. So, I didn't feel that it actually qualified for a list of feature films. But because I love it so much, I wanted it to have a presence in this video, which is why I will be using one of my Witching Season t-shirts as the background. And so, here we go. My top 20 horror movies of the last 20 years. Coming in at number 20 is Saw. Now, I'm sure this would make a lot of people's top 20 of the last 20 years list. But for me, it's only here at the bottom, simply because it sort of lost its luster. I don't really know how to explain it. It's just not as rewatchable as it used to be for me. I remember when I first saw this, I thought it was absolutely amazing, especially the ending. It completely blew me away. Probably one of my all-time favorite endings in horror movie history. However, it doesn't quite stack up to the rest of the movies on this list for me personally. In fact, I've never actually made it past Saw 4 in that franchise. I know, I do need to revisit it. I need to watch the first 4 over again, and then continue, watching Saw 5 and on. I do really want to check out the rest of the series. I just haven't gotten around to it yet. And maybe that's why I don't have as much love for this franchise as others do. And the first film is here at number 20. At number 19 is Final Destination 5. This is my favorite film in the Final Destination series, mainly because of its great ending. Again, it's one of my all-time favorite endings in horror movie history. Along with having such a fantastic twist, Final Destination 5 also features sort of a slasher aspect to the story, which is why it's my favorite in the franchise. And number 19 in my top 20 favorite horror movies of the last 20 years. Coming in at number 18 is Insidious. I would consider Insidious to be a modern-day horror classic. It's that great haunted house storyline, only it's not the house that's haunted, as the tagline says. There are so many classic moments in this one, and some genuinely scary scenes. It's very rewatchable, and it's one that I tend to watch every time it's on TV. And I really enjoy the sequel as well, Insidious 2. But Insidious Chapter 1 is number 18 in my top 20. Next up at number 17 is a very modern horror film. It's Hellfest. This is a modern day slasher flick which I actually reviewed in my Slashback Challenge earlier in the year. I absolutely love the setting in this one, and the ending, fantastic. Hellfest definitely has the potential to become a modern day slasher franchise, and I hope it happens. Coming in at number 16 is Terrifier. Now this is definitely a popular one. It's a Halloween slasher film. What's not to like? You have a scary clown, amazing gore, and fortunately there's a sequel coming very soon. But for now, the first Terrifier is number 16 in my top 20. Coming in at number 15 is A Quiet Place. Now, if I wasn't such a huge slasher fan, this would probably be much higher on my list, because it's not actually a slasher film, but it's a creature feature. Now, I love creature features as well, but just not as much as slashers, hence why this only makes the 15th spot. With that being said, I also consider A Quiet Place, like Insidious, to be a modern-day horror classic. It also features what I consider to be one of the most heroic and saddest scenes in horror history. Coming in at number 14 is The Strangers Pray at Night. Now this is of course the sequel to The Strangers, which I'm sure would appear on most other people's top 20 list. However, I actually prefer this sequel because it's more of a straight-up slasher flick, while the original is more of a home invasion film. The Strangers Pray at Night also has an incredible soundtrack, and that plays an important role in the film. At number 13 is Leprechaun Returns. Now, when I did my Slashback review for this one, I mentioned how this would probably be in my top 20 favorite horror films of the last 20 years. And here it is at number 13. This one feels like old school horror. It's fun, there are some great lines, some good kills, and it's just an all-around great horror film. This is a prime example of how modern horror should be done. I hope more horror movies follow in its footsteps. My number 12 pick here is purely personal. It's Phantasm Ravager. Now, I know there are not a lot of fans of this one, but I absolutely love it. Phantasm is quite possibly my favorite horror franchise overall because I don't think there is a dud in the series. When I first watched this one, I admit I was slightly disappointed, only because I had waited so long for the conclusion to the Phantasm saga. However, after revisiting it last year, I absolutely fell in love with it. I wouldn't anticipate Phantasm Ravager being this high or even included on anyone else's list, but for a Phantasm fan like myself, this is right where it belongs. At number 11 is Drag Me to Hell. This to me is the modern day Evil Dead. This is how the Evil Dead remake should have been done. Sam Raimi directed this one, of course, and it definitely feels like a Sam Raimi film. I absolutely love Drag Me to Hell. My wife does as well, and again, it has one of the greatest endings in horror movie history. Notice a trend? You better fear the Lamia. That thing is creepy. And now we head into my top 10 with the film that Brad considers to be the greatest horror film made in the last 20 years. It's Halloween 2018. I love it, don't get me wrong, but somehow when compiling this list, it only made it as far as number 10. There are 9 films I prefer over this one. It is worth mentioning, however, that Halloween 2018 is pretty high in my Halloween franchise ranking. So if you haven't checked that out, please be sure to do so. Like Leprechaun Returns, this is how modern day horror should be done. Coming in at number 9 is American Psycho. American Psycho, another modern day classic. Most people have probably seen it. I don't think I need to say much about it. If for some reason you haven't seen it though, what are you waiting for? I mean, it says it right there. A movie you shouldn't miss. I agree. Coming in at number 8 is The Loved Ones. Man, I love this movie. But to be honest, my wife loves it even more than I do. This is one of her all-time favorite horror films. Not just of the last 20 years, of all time. And rightfully so. Lola Stone is somehow sexy and scary at the same time. The perfect villain. My number 7 pick is another one I initially thought would be much higher on my list. It's The Cabin in the Woods. A few years back, this might have been number 1. I absolutely love this movie, and I loved it even more a few years ago. Sort of like Saw, but not quite as much. It's lost its luster over the years for me. But it's still pretty incredible. Seeing The Cabin in the Woods in the theater was one of my favorite cinema experiences of my life. It has everything a horror buff could want. It's a horror buff's dream. And I'll never understand the people who hate this movie. It's awesome. At number 6 is Session 9. Again, this is another favorite of mine, and another one I originally thought would be higher on my list. I bet if I had just watched this earlier today, it would be much higher. It's one of those movies I forget how much I actually enjoy until I rewatch it. It's a psychological slasher set in a fantastic location, an abandoned mental hospital which I had the honor of visiting years back. If you haven't seen Session 9, I highly recommend this one. It's number 6 in my top 20 favorite horror movies of the last 20 years. Well, we've made it to the top 5, and coming in at number 5 is Trick or Treat. Is it the greatest Halloween anthology film of all time? Probably, and I'm sure others would agree. In at number 4 is one of my favorite modern-day slasher films, Behind the Mask: The Rise of Leslie Vernon. I've talked about this one a bit in the past, and I absolutely love it. It's one that just gets better and better every time I see it, and I think it's such an amazing concept. You've heard me say it twice already, and you might hear me say it once more. But this is how modern horror should be. You will hear me say it once more, because my number 3 pick is Hatchet. Old school American horror. It feels like an 80s slasher set in modern times. Again, exactly how modern horror should be. I mentioned at the start of this video that if I included multiple films from the same franchise, there would be one scenario where 4 films from the same series would be included. And I was referring to Hatchet. I love all 4 of the Hatchet films almost equally, but the original Hatchet seen here takes the top spot in that ranking. And it's number 3 in my top 20 favorite horror movies of the last 20 years. I might get some grief for this one, but my number 2 pick is House of a Thousand Corpses. Yes, I know most people prefer The Devil's Rejects, but I actually prefer this one. This is one of those horror films I wish I could go back and watch for the first time all over again, because I was absolutely blown away the first time I saw this. I did not see it in theaters, but I had heard a lot of good things about it, so when it was released on DVD, I picked it up almost day one. It's funny too, because I picked it up along with The Texas Chainsaw Massacre on DVD, the original. And House of a Thousand Corpses was clearly inspired by that film. I honestly feel that this is Rob Zombie's masterpiece, not The Devil's Rejects. This one feels more like a classic horror film to me. But, of course, that's just my personal opinion, and House of a Thousand Corpses is my number 2 favorite horror movie of the last 20 years. Which brings us to my number 1 favorite horror movie of the last 20 years. What could it be? Is it the Child's Play remake? Okay, no, it's not. I mean, I loved it, but it's not quite top 20 material. But maybe if I did decide to include multiple films from the same franchise, it would have been featured here. Who knows? Because my number 1 favorite horror movie of the last 20 years is a Child's Play film. You probably guessed it. It's Curse of Chucky. If you've seen my Child's Play ranking, then you know Curse of Chucky is my favorite Child's Play film. Which reminds me, I do need to do an updated ranking and include the remake. Spoiler alert though, Curse of Chucky is still number 1, because it's my favorite horror movie of the last 20 years. Curse of Chucky managed to be a fantastic modern-day sequel of a classic, and somehow rebooted the franchise as well. After the mess that was Seed of Chucky, Curse brought the series back to its more serious tone. I love Chucky's look in this one, the setting is great, the kills are awesome, but the best thing of all for me from Curse of Chucky is the final girl. Nika is probably one of my favorite final girls in horror history. Curse of Chucky is the modern-day horror movie I tell people they need to watch. To me, it's one of those films you watch and wonder why it took you so long to see it. While other horror franchises at the time were going through a series of remakes, Curse of Chucky revitalized the sequel scene. It proved that original slasher storylines and timelines could live on. It appealed to fans of the original Child's Play and managed to gain a whole new audience. For these reasons and more, Curse of Chucky is my favorite horror movie of the last 20 years. So guys, that's it. My top 20 favorite horror movies of the last 20 years. What did you think of my list? Comment below and let me know. What are some of your favorite horror movies of the last 20 years? Let me know in the comment section or film a video response. I'd love to see your list. Thanks for watching, guys, and as always, be kind, subscribe.